everyone to our show. I'm Eddy, and we have Bruno here with us. Hey, Bruno.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. So we're going to talk about, we're going to take a different tangent this time around, and we're going to talk about a show that's recently finished, and it had its series finale called Andor, Season 2. And despite having a 97% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and being hailed as one of the best TV shows of our decade, I have noticed that it hasn't really garnered the attention it ought to, given that, number one, it's in the Star Wars universe, number two, it's most likely the best Star Wars show around in recent memory, and number three, it is the show that revives the Star Wars franchise on TV. Each episode is done similarly to each movie was done before, in terms of the arc of the story and so on. So, given the many flops that have taken place in the Star Wars franchise recently, in film and on TV, and flop in terms of quality we're talking about, not necessarily in the box office. What are your thoughts overall in terms of what factors have led to Andor being overlooked by a broader audience?
Look, I mean, it's no secret. Star Wars in the last couple of years has been a little goofy, not as much of a storytelling and more just sci-fi lasers. Haha, let's have fun. So it hasn't been really the cinematic or theatrical storytelling masterpiece that we're used to, with the exception of the first two seasons of The Mandalorian, which were pretty all right. And you know, that's what it is. I think people sort of wrote it off before even giving it a chance. If we look at the sequels of the Skywalker trilogy, they were absolutely horrendous. If we look at the Book of Boba Fett, they took an amazing character and turned him into something that's not even, someone doesn't even want to take a second look at. If we look at a show that started amazing, such as The Mandalorian, look what they did in the third season. Look what they did to, I mean, Ahsoka is not terrible. They have some good elements like Thrawn. You know, he's very well portrayed, I would say. But it could have been better, you know? So I think you look at all these recent Star Wars
So not the
shows.
Acolyte?
I'm going to admit that completely, because just what they did to Ki-Adi-Mundi, and they destroyed his whole age, and
Or
had to
Carrie-Anne Moss, the
yeah,
infamous Canadian actress who was also in the Matrix franchise. The way
yeah,
it shouldn't be spoiler alert right now because it's been out for a while.
yeah,
How they killed her off within the first 10 minutes, and the kung fu based fight scenes in
yeah.
the Star Wars universe that has nothing to do with Jedi training whatsoever.
Yeah, and Star Wars is, you know, it's George Lucas originally. He based their costumes and their theology, if you will, on samurais mixed with, you know, something of a mystical power behind it. And this was abandoned, especially in The Acolyte. They completely destroyed that, and they didn't even follow the principles of the lore. They destroyed the Skywalker trilogy by doing that. You know, if we just look at the daughters being born out of thin air,
Episode 3.
you know, it's same thing with Rey. It's same thing with the Acolyte. I mean, guys, there's only one real phenomenon of that, and that's Anakin Skywalker. Point being, look, back to your original question for Andor. I mean, I think people just overlooked it because of the sheer disappointment of Star Wars in recent days. Like I said, with the exception of parts of Ahsoka and the first two seasons of The Mandalorian, and I'm not going to forget Obi-Wan Kenobi had a couple of good parts. Like the last episode was pretty good, with the exception of Rhea somehow coming back to life. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, overall, you know, I think it's just the disappointment with Star Wars translated into this one and into Andor, and it's been a shock for people who actually took some time to really watch, especially the second season, which was, in my opinion, a masterpiece.
One of the things that's noticeable with any new Star Wars announcement of a new show or an upcoming film is how exciting it becomes. And there's this level of excitement that's unlike other franchises right now. And one of the things that we end up experiencing as total and utter or partial disappointment from that show, particularly some of the ones we mentioned. Now, The Acolyte is the exception because it did not really garner any marketing attention. If I remember correctly, it was not heavily marketed at all. In fact, that might have been the strategy behind it, based on quality. It barely had any marketing of let's say 2 weeks, right? And I only saw its marketing on YouTube, which was the oddest thing. Apart from The Acolyte, Ahsoka or Kenobi, which are the more recent TV shows, The Mandalorian included, how would you rank in terms of the top five, in your view?
including Andor.
With the first being the best versus fifth place, fifth best, let's say.
Yeah, but including Andor, right?
Of course, of course.
Okay, Andor is number one by all means. Number two, it's gonna sound a little controversial despite what I just said, but I would put Kenobi number two just because I have a very very high level of interest for Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's definitely my favorite Jedi, and I think they had some really good elements, some other poor elements, but there's a lot of good snippets and cool little pieces in there that made it at least in line with the story. It didn't break the lore, with the exception of people getting stabbed in the stomach and surviving. But other than that,
Or lit up on fire, just like Anakin Skywalker was in
yeah,
Episode 3, and somehow surviving without a single scar.
yeah, recovering almost immediately, basically.
Yeah.
So, I mean, other than that, though, I still think, especially like the fight scene between Vader and Kenobi, when he regained his full potential, that's when it was really like, wow. And I wrote a
Perhaps
comment.
let me simplify it. Let me simplify it. Top three instead of five.
Number one, Andor, hands down. Number two, I would say Kenobi, and number three, honestly, Ahsoka.
So number one for me would be Andor. It was sheer masterpiece, almost how Game of Thrones used to be, right?
Yeah.
Or Westworld, the first season, in fact. And second place, I would have to give it to Ahsoka. Now, I'm not saying Ahsoka was the best ever, right? Ever made. And number three, I would give it to The Mandalorian, particularly its first 2 seasons. Now, the third season, it kind of died off. It went on a comedic side. And one of the challenges, and I'll start with The Mandalorian first, one of the challenges that Pedro Pascal has as The Mandalorian is he's always being outshined by Grogu, who's Baby Yoda, right? In terms of marketing perspective, it's great for the kids, right? But also they use a puppet and an electronic version of the way they film it. So they have to film two different Grogus at most times. One of the things that's noticeable is literally that, and Pedro Pascal definitely knows that. Number two is how he has to keep his mask throughout the entire show on and somehow do as little as possible with his acting, right? On my number two list is Ahsoka. Ahsoka was a surprise, not because of obviously the choice of actors and also the choice of villain playing Baylan Skoll, right? But particularly, look, there were some of the stuff like the fight stuff, like she's in space and flying off a ship to another ship and destroying X-Wing fighters and stuff like that. That's a little far-fetched. But apart from that, it sort of reminded us of what Star Wars used to be. Right? A discovery of oneself, exploring, going on this journey, especially Ahsoka's apprentice, who does not have any faith in herself or ability to use the Force even, as she believes that she is cut off from the Force, or she doesn't have any of those powers. And then Baylan Skoll is the surprise. Obviously, Rape did end up passing away last year, so they do have to find another actor.
They did find someone, eh?
So who is it instead of Ray Stevenson?
It's one of his friends. I think it's the person who played, the big warrior from Game of Thrones who kills Pedro Pascal in the fight scene.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's him because they were friends in real life.
Okay, I think that would be an interesting choice. An odd choice, but
They look alike. They even released from one of the Star Wars like VIP events showing the second season. They showed what he would look like. They look pretty similar. Obviously, it's a recast, so it's not the exact same. But
Yeah.
they were friends. They knew each other. So I think it might be a good fit.
Speaking of recasting, I'll talk about Bail Organa. And just to finish off on the point about Baylan Skoll, why he became the surprisingly most interesting character in my view is because he's actually on a different journey than everybody else. He's not just a dark Jedi, right? Or a former Jedi general who's turned to the dark side and he's just a hired mercenary. We discovered that he's actually there to explore the birth of the Force. And that's based on Star Wars canon and the animated series, of course.
Clone Wars. Shout out Clone Wars.
So, yeah, it's based off of that. So we'll see how they do that spin in season 2. And Andor is my number one. And the reason Andor is number one, it's because it's unlike any other Star Wars show. Number one. Number two, it's not only based on events, but also driven heavily by characters, and particularly the fact that it's not focused solely on the main character Cassian Andor. And in the first season, we do see him as someone who's very self-serving. Literally, the first episode, he just is escaping justice after committing a homicide, and he gets recruited by Luthen, and he somehow becomes, until the end of season 2 still, he's still grappling like, am I truly a revolutionary? Right? The one thing that's also noticeable, one of the themes, is who the real leader or the one who created the rebellion truly is. Despite Senator Mon Mothma taking the credit for it throughout the franchise, the real creator was in fact not her. Not even Senator Bail Organa. It was Luthen, played by the brilliant Stellan Skarsgård. Right? How do you believe the writers handled him throughout the 2 seasons, in your view? Let's start with him.
I think he starts out, or throughout the whole series, he's somewhat mysterious. So there's never that you never get the full version of him. You never do until the pressure starts mounting and there starts to be multiple events taking place, especially in the second season. Like if we look at the Ghorman Massacre, if we look at when they're trying to help Mon Mothma escape, when the ISB starts circling in. Then
One of my favorite scenes, actually.
But that's the best. But that's when you start to see it starts to unravel, right? The story starts unraveling and he's losing his facade of the antiques shop owner. And there's a lot of little gimmicks in there, like little Easter eggs in there. Like there's a Keldorian mask, there's a Gungan skull. There's actually, I don't know if you saw the stone with the Mortis gods on it as well. There's a lot of little Easter eggs, and there's also that mask that he keeps, metaphorical mask obviously. And then you start to see that as the situation becomes more tense, as the pressure starts to mount, especially on Senator Mon Mothma in particular, then you start to see the panic set in. You start to see that this intrigue, this spy craft that he's been mastering, and the writers have been conveying so masterfully for let's say a season and a half. At that point, it starts to disappear, and we start to sense the urgency. To answer your question, the writers, they did a fantastic job, and we see that character progression from calm, collected, but serious throughout the whole series. Behind the scenes, he's always doing something to help grow the rebellion. And we get to the point where when time's up, and there's no more that calm and collected. It's really stop messing about. Now's the time to really lock in. We have to do what we have to do to get the rebellion started, save the people, support the galaxy, and break the chains of the Empire.
So one of the other key elements of season 2, and she does become it, is Senator Mon Mothma, who's one of my favorite characters of the franchise because of this show. Because previously Genevieve O'Reilly, who does play her, in episode 3, she had all her scenes cut. They are in the deleted scenes, of course.
And I've watched them, and they're good. They're very good.
And well, it does add more depth to what's actually happening to the other separatist wing of the Senate at the time in episode 3. Senator Padme Amidala is also part of that too, and she starts distancing herself from Anakin and the Chancellor at the time. One of the things that's remarkably well done, especially in season 1, I do believe it was episode 7, is that scene when she's meeting up with one of her close friends when they were young, and she's trying to recruit him to be her foundation's president or something along those lines. When in fact she just needed another method, because she was being heavily under the magnifying glass to funnel the funding for the rebellion's activities. So that sequence was particularly well done. And then what happens in season 2, it was against the advice of Luthen, obviously, to have him recruited, and then the choices that Luthen had to make instead of her. And throughout the series, you do see him making those decisions, even though it's always at odds with some of the characters, such as Mon Mothma, because of their principles and values. The other one we should talk about, obviously, because the show is literally called Andor, is Cassian Andor, Diego Luna. And let's not forget that it is a show that not just had a 97% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but also it did have a lot of award nominations, primarily at the Emmys. It had, for season 1, it had received 8 nominations and 3 BAFTA nominations as well, including Diego Luna, who plays Cassian Andor, as well as the actress who plays his mother, Fiona Shaw, who was also in Killing Eve, actually. Another thing that the show does very well is not just character depth, but monologues.
Yeah.
So we saw Andy Serkis in season 1. He had this amazing monologue. Another memorable monologue is Luthen, when he talks about what actually drives him to someone who he has secretly recruited as a spy for the rebellion's activities. Another one is Fiona Shaw's monologue, in which she's telling people, as she had just passed away in that episode, she's telling people through a hologram, now is the time to stand up and fight, basically. And segueing into season 2, some of the most memorable monologues, it's a like constant theme, right? And obviously a visual motif is always about entrapment, which reminds me of 1940s cinema, right?
Yeah.
Particularly how Casablanca was made, with a lot of the motifs, sort of like, instead of having jail bars, all like the wallpapers were sort of similar to that idea of entrapment, the way it's shot, the compositions. And particularly with Mon Mothma scenes, you do notice that motif to be consistent throughout the show as her facade is falling down. Right, and you'll notice the way her scenes are shot versus the other characters. They're very different, almost as if it's different directors shooting it, right?
Yeah.
So what happens to Cassian Andor? Obviously, the show leaves us and segues into Rogue One, the movie, which in itself was a good movie. In fact, it was one of the movies that was another surprise in the franchise, because it was right before episode 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
Actually, when it came out. And they also had brilliant actors. So what are your thoughts about the overall narrative of the Star Wars saga versus Andor?
I think it's a tricky question. Honestly, it's a tricky question because, look, it ties in beautifully. It fits perfectly. It gives you a prequel to the prequel of A New Hope, which is Rogue One, right? It's literally, it ends right when Rogue One starts, if you will, or like a let's say a day or two in between. But you have that direct transition, and then you've got A New Hope right after. And it also gives you the sort of actual story, other than Star Wars Rebels, it gives you the actual story, the actual true nitty-gritty of how the rebellion was founded. You know, we hear about the rebellion. In Rebels, we see rebel activities, rebel cells. We eventually get to the point where the rebellion is something. But now we know, like, between, let's say, season 3 and season 4 Rebels, now we know what fits in that place, right? And what is there? It's Andor, especially season 2 of Andor. You have Mon Mothma's speech and her speech, her monologue in the Senate. You know, you mentioned all these different monologues, but the only person to call out the true enemy is Mon Mothma. She calls Emperor Palpatine the enemy. So
there's a story behind that, actually. Initially in the script, in the teleplay, a speech was not written for her. And then she really asked Tony Gilroy, who's the executive producer, to write one for her, and then he could use it in a montage, which is exactly what happened, by the way, as she's about to escape after that. 2 other characters I totally forgot to discuss are also Saw Gerrera, played by the brilliant Forrest Whitaker. Yeah. We finally saw him emerge in season 2.
Important.
As well as Director Krennic, who's the big baddie in Rogue One, who's supposedly second or third in command of the Empire eventually. Another thing that I've noticed with the show is how it focuses on having this idea of a secret or shadow government that's really actually controlling everything versus the one who is the head honcho and people around the head honcho. And in this example, I'm talking about in season 2, the ISB. So it's not Darth Vader or Emperor Palpatine that's actually making all these decisions. In fact, they never appear in Andor altogether. Yeah. But in fact, it's Director Krennic in season 2. He's got this wonderful, in episode 3, wonderful scene in which he's listening to everyone's reports, and then he gives he tells people what the direction's going to be with Gorman. And it ideally brings us to the Gorman story throughout season 2.
Yeah.
And I do think particularly it was very well done. Interestingly enough, one of the things I was a little bit asking myself is, why did the Ghorman language have to have French actors, almost as if they're speaking French, but it's a fictitious language they created?
Yeah.
Phonetically, it sounds very much like French.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, and I had to watch a lot of behind the scenes footage for this, of the basis of the French Revolution. And that's basically what they were trying to do with the Gorman stuff that ends up being the Ghorman Massacre, in which Mon Mothma refers to. And obviously the Gorman genocide ends up being the propelling element, the impetus for this rush to have the rebellion announced.
Yeah, I thought the French actors were there to mimic the French resistance to Vichy France and Nazi occupation. That was my thought process because it reminded me a lot of and don't get mad at me, folks, but an episode of Star Trek Voyager where there's an alien species called the Hirogen. Long story short, they take over the ship and they use the holodecks to simulate a hunt, and they mimic France when it's under occupation, Nazi occupation. So it really reminded me of that, and it made me think also of Hearts of Iron, which is, you know, the same. It's always like the same style, the same. It just gave me that sort of semblance, right? Where obviously in Star Wars, the Galactic Empire, exactly what it is, it's supposed to mimic that, right? Germany during the 1930s and 40s, so World War II particularly, and the resistance is supposed to be not necessarily the the rebellion is not supposed to be the allies, but it's more like the resistance, the local resistance in all these different countries, and eventually they band together with the allies. Yes, but you know, suffice it to say, it was quite a nice comparison to see that, and it really gave some more realistic feel and helped us connect with reality during those scenes in the Gorman Massacre.
Another character that was brilliantly done were two of them actually. There's Bix Colleen, who's played by Adria Arjona. She plays the love interest of Cassian Andor, and then what she ends up having to do in order to prioritize the rebellion. But one other pair that I found incredibly interesting to watch were, well, in the in the TV show, it was Cyril and Deidre's relationship. So Deidre is this high-ranking officer in the Empire, and she's sort of like the middle person in the ranks, because she's like a supervisor, but at the same time she's still under the command of Partagas and Rennick. But at the same time, she's trying to advance herself, and then she's also sleeping and in a relationship officially with Cyril, but at the same time using Cyril for her covert operations without telling him truly what the operation's about.
Yeah.
The mining efforts of the Gorman planet to build their Death Star. So, spoiler, I did warn everyone about the spoilers beforehand. You were forewarned.
Yeah.
What were your what was your favorite episode in your view?
I think it was episode 9 when Mon Mothma gave her speech, if I'm not mistaken. Episode 9, yeah, that's what it was. And it was, honestly, it was really, really, really good. My favorite episode by far. I think that was the climax of the series. I think that's really where we saw the birth of the rebellion, if you will. And we saw really how dangerous it was to speak out against the Empire, how dangerous it was to speak out, no matter what your position is. You know, she's a senator, a high-ranking senator, respected and to a certain extent amongst her colleagues. She's been there for years, decades in the Senate, and meant nothing. You know, she was branded a traitor just like anyone else who would speak against the Empire. So I think that was it really connected all the different points of Star Wars. The end of Episode 3, or Episode 3 when they were the Loyalist Committee, the delegation of 2000, when they were discussing opposing Chancellor Palpatine at the time. And then this really helped us give like a credence to the rebellion and to what happens after the fall of the Empire as well. There's really it connects every point of the saga, especially the political side of things.
My two favorite episodes were obviously episode 9, just like you, of the second season. It's just the episode is very much centered around Senator Mon Mothma. And the other person we didn't speak about is Bail Organa. The recasting of Bail Organa from Jimmy Smith to Benjamin Bratt caused a ruckus on social media, and then I think it died down.
He played his...
I actually think it was the first time they recast Jimmy Smits in any of the franchise shows or movies. Till this day, we're told it's a scheduling conflict, but Jimmy Smits never confirmed it, right? So I'm not sure. I think Benjamin Bratt did his part. You know, it wasn't magnificent, and I don't think it's based on Senator Bail Organa at all, this show. So I mean, it was just a minor part. I mean, the ruckus was a little bit uncalled for, right? You do need an actor at the end of the day to play that role, because in episode 9 specifically, they do have an integral part in helping Mon Mothma escape.
I'm just worried. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just worried about one thing, and it's Rogue One has Jimmy Smits, right? And then Andor has Benjamin
Well,
Bratt.
every other movie has.
Yeah, well, that's it. You know, like if you look at episode 2, episode 3, but really, like, if we really want to tie it in, it's really Rogue One. You know, it's literally like a couple days after the end of Andor, and he's wearing the same outfit as well. I don't know if you noticed with the code cylinders that go across the same outfit. They look somewhat the same physically, so it wasn't like a complete different person in terms of appearance. It was able to work. But I'm just saying, I mean, look, I would have put in a little bit more effort into it if there was a way to try to get Jimmy Smits, even if it meant, I'm sure they could have delayed a recording 1 week, like a production shoot 1 week to get Jimmy Smits on board, film all his scenes in advance, you know, type thing. Could have been something like that. I think the scheduling excuse was maybe a little bit of, you know,
A faux pas.
malarkey. Put it like that.
So the other episode. So this is tough because I really did enjoy episode 10 of season 2 as well, which is based literally on Luthen and his adoptive daughter, who does work with him till the end at the antique store or antique shop. And one of the things that I particularly liked about that episode is you do find out why he's sort of the way he's always been, on his toes, always nomadic, sedentary, for an obvious reason, right? Because he'll be wanted for whatever he does. And how they sort of tied it off in the end, in terms of how they had to get, because everybody needs to die, right? Technically,
Right.
except for Mon Mothma and or Senator Organa and the twins, the Skywalker twins. So I did particularly like how they dragged it out till the end. It's the adoptive daughter's job to actually try to extricate him out of there, and then the tough decisions she had to make in order for him not to be succumb to further interrogation and torture. Another thing that I particularly loved, actually, and got me obsessed for a while, was the Chandrila wedding. So in season 1, Mon Mothma had to, have funding for her operations because she was almost out of money, and she had the scrutiny of the Empire on her at every moment, which was increasing. So she was forced to marry her daughter to this, well, she called him a gangster, and then we'll call him just a business mogul, okay, for the sake of the show. And in season 2, we finally see that ceremony happening, but also not the ceremony itself that I particularly enjoy the most, but it's what happens before and after. Okay, with Mon Mothma and Luthen, particularly with Mon Mothma's friend and the decision they have to make. And then the dancing sequence that I actually edited and posted myself on my other channel, in which she's, we're just assuming at face value she's just dancing around, but we're noticing how difficult it is for her to even let go. Because usually she's very calm, composed, collected, and it's a side of her that we do see in that sequence that we do not ever see and get to enjoy, actually. So she's drinking, which she's not usually accustomed to as much, and she lets herself go. Even her husband in the show, and it's just a political marriage too in her case, notices a different person in front of him too on the dance floor, and how her facade is going and how she's letting go of everything because of the decisions she has to be part of.
Yeah.
Not necessarily make herself, but eventually she will be responsible to make them. So those are my takes, and I do think the hope is, initially it was supposed to be 5 seasons.
Yeah.
But they had to rush it so that it finishes in the second season. I do hope it propels other shows on the Star Wars franchise. I actually think the Old Republic should be the next franchise because it's great material and it's new. It's never been done on film or TV show before. And mature writing like the ones we've seen in Andor ought to be the next step or the prime examples they base it off of. Any final words from you, Bruno?
Absolutely. Listen, just for the Old Republic, I think they should be careful. They should be careful because I've played the Old Republic. I've got multiple characters. The storytelling in the Old Republic is already really, really, really good. So you got to be careful. I know it's not canon. It is considered legends, but you got to be
But
careful.
what about Andor? Final words on Andor.
Andor. Well, hold on. Let me just tell you. Let me just tell you on the Old Republic, they just got to be careful.
Okay.
I'm saying they just got to be careful because the storytelling is really, really good. They got to make sure they respect that storytelling. That's number one. Number two, on Andor, listen, it was a masterpiece of what Star Wars should be. Reminded me of the Clone Wars, reminded me of Episode 3 of the actual Skywalker trilogy, reminded me of the first, particularly the first season of Mando, reminded me of parts of Rebels. It reminded me of Rebels as well. It was really just a masterpiece, and this is what Star Wars should be. And it doesn't necessarily need Jedi and Sith to be Star Wars. Star Wars is so much more than that. It's a huge galaxy. There's trillions and quadrillions of characters and quadrillions of parsecs of space to explore. This is what it should be always.
All right. That's been Real Talk with Eddy Cara. Until next time, till we discuss not only about politics, but also about film and what may happen in our daily lives. Till next time.